I saw the signs of betrayal, so I took action. 2 weeks later, she filed for divorce, but I was prepared. It was the silence that did it. The kind of stillness that fills a room after years of comfort, turning into an eerie void that no longer feels like home. I knew something was off. There were no explosions, no shouting matches. It wasn't the typical Hollywood drama, but there were signs. Tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in her behavior that told me the woman I had shared 6 years with was no longer the same. I had always prided myself on being a trusting man. My wife, Lauren, and I built a life together, brick by brick. She was my anchor, the partner I thought I could always count on. Her laugh, her spark, the way she looked at me with those eyes like a summer day. How could I have imagined that she was secretly planning to tear everything we built apart? Lauren, 32, was the kind of woman whose presence could light up any room. Tall, with a lean frame that seemed effortless, her brown eyes warm and intelligent, always focused on the person she was with. She had this energy, this charm that would make even a stranger feel like family. And the way her skin glowed, a smooth olive tone that turned golden in the sun. She was breathtaking. For 6 years, everything about us had seemed perfect. Sure, like any couple, we'd had our fair share of arguments, but those were just stepping stones. We'd laugh at the silly things, debate over what movie to watch, then enjoy a quiet dinner together. It was the rhythm of our lives. We were a team, or so I thought. The first sign of trouble came about 6 months ago. I didn't notice it at first. Little things. Her phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter or coffee table, was now always in her hands. The phone never left her side. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd always been somewhat attached to it. But then came the password. Lauren had never used one before. Why the sudden change? I didn't ask at first, thinking it was just a precaution. She had explained it away as work emails and hackers. Fine. But then, the phone calls, always in another room, always private. It wasn't like her. If it was a friend calling, why would she step outside to answer? Why the secrecy? A couple of days later, the oddest thing happened. We were having breakfast when she casually mentioned that we should organize our finances. We had always kept things separate, but out of nowhere, she suggested we get everything in order. Account passwords, documents, everything. I was taken aback. There was no urgency in her voice, just a cold practicality. She told me it was just in case of emergencies. I didn't question her, but inside, a storm was brewing. Have you thought about organizing the bank stuff? She asked again, a few days later. She asked with that innocent smile of hers, but my gut twisted in unease. Something wasn't right, but I didn't know what to make of it. I decided to wait it out. I watched her behavior more closely. There was something about it that felt like a puzzle I was just starting to piece together, and it didn't add up. That's when I heard it by accident. One Wednesday evening, I happened to be running errands in the same area Lauren had mentioned meeting a friend for coffee. It seemed innocent enough, but when I walked past the cafe, she wasn't there with a friend. Instead, she was outside, pacing, phone pressed tightly to her ear. I stood there, hiding in my car, as the conversation continued. Words drifted out to me. It's almost ready, starting fresh soon. My stomach twisted. What was she planning? That wasn't normal work talk. That wasn't friend drama. It sounded bigger. When I got home, I casually asked her how the coffee date went. She smiled, told me her friend had been venting about her boyfriend, and that she had offered some advice. I smiled along with her, pretending to believe it. But something told me I wasn't just overthinking this. There was something deeper happening, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The tension kept building over the following days. Her mood was distant. Conversations that used to flow freely now felt like pulling teeth. She barely answered my questions about future plans. Plans that once had her eyes sparkling with excitement. Now she was just nodding, giving one-word answers. It wasn't just her behavior that had changed. It was the way she started hiding things. It was in the little details. The constant secret phone calls, the sudden need to organize everything financially, and most of all, the growing distance between us. Something was coming, and I had to figure out what it was. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just stress from work. Maybe she was feeling the pressure. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. I had to prepare for the worst. If something was wrong, I needed to protect myself. The more I thought about it, the more the weight of my suspicions grew. Each day that passed, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for something catastrophic to happen. My wife, Lauren, was slipping away from me, and I had no idea why. But I couldn't just sit back and wait for the inevitable. I'd been talking to my buddy, Alex, for the last few days. He had a background in law and seemed to always have a level-headed approach. I trusted him, so I laid it all out. The weird behavior, the secrecy, the sudden focus on our finances. He didn't tell me anything new, but he did say something that hit me like a ton of bricks. "Better safe than sorry," Alex had said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "You need to protect yourself, man. You don't know if she's planning something behind your back. And if she is, you've got to make sure you've got your assets locked down." The thought had crossed my mind. Protecting my finances felt extreme. But if things really were as bad as I was beginning to think, I had no choice. I had to make sure that I wasn't left with nothing. If she was really planning to leave me, I had to be prepared. By the time Lauren came home that night, I had already started the process. I didn't want to make a scene, but the pit in my stomach was growing with each passing minute. I pulled up our joint account on the laptop, and as I scanned through the numbers, my heart raced. A few small transfers had been made. Nothing huge, just amounts that didn't make sense. A couple $100 here, a few hundred there. I didn't know what they were for, but it didn't sit right with me. These weren't bill payments. These weren't for groceries. There was no clear explanation. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was just overreacting, but I wasn't sure anymore. That night, after Lauren had gone to bed, I made my move. Slowly, carefully, I began transferring assets. It felt like a betrayal, but at the same time, it felt like survival. I wasn't going to let her take everything I'd worked for, especially if she was plotting something. It was a decision I never thought I'd have to make. But here I was, preparing for the worst. I didn't touch the house, too risky. But everything else, the savings, the investments, all went into my mom's name. It was safer that way. I could still keep up appearances, still make it seem like everything was fine. I'd leave just enough in our joint account to not raise suspicion. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't act now, I'd regret it later. So I did it. I protected myself. Over the next few days, Lauren seemed different, but not in the way I expected. She wasn't angry or suspicious. She was almost too calm, almost too friendly. Felt like she was trying to throw me off the scent. Her actions, her smiles, the way she'd make small talk about random things, it all felt rehearsed. I had prepared for the worst, but I didn't expect her to be so good at hiding it. She never mentioned finances again. It was like she had dropped the subject altogether, and part of me thought maybe I had overreacted. Maybe she had just been stressed, just worried about our future, like she'd said, but my gut told me otherwise. I was being careful, keeping track of everything. And that's when I noticed something that made my heart stop. A few days ago, Lauren had been talking to me about organizing our accounts again. It was as if she was waiting for me to take action first, to make the first move. And now there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Was she just waiting for me to slip up? Waiting for me to give her the green light? I didn't know what she was planning, but I wasn't about to sit there and let her catch me off guard. I had made my move first. Now I had to wait for her to slip, wait for the truth to come out. But then, 2 weeks later, she hit me with it. The moment she sat me down on the couch, I knew something was coming. Her demeanor was too calm, too composed. She turned off the TV, her fingers tapping nervously on the remote as if she were gathering her thoughts. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an anxiety I couldn't escape. She took a deep breath, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm. But the words hit me like a sledgehammer. I didn't answer right away, but in my mind, 1,000 scenarios played out. Was this the moment? Was she finally going to confess? Or was this just a routine discussion? One of those we need to fix our communication talks that had become so common in the last few months? I braced myself for what was to come, though I had a sickening feeling in my stomach. The truth was about to land, whether I was ready for it or not. "I think we should get a divorce," she said, and the words, so matter-of-fact, almost casual, made my blood run cold. For a moment, everything stopped. I couldn't hear anything. The weight of the phrase, "we should get a divorce," echoed in my ears. This was it, the inevitable conclusion to everything I had feared. But I wasn't about to show it. I refused to let her see the devastation that threatened to overwhelm me. Her explanation came in a steady stream, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a tearful outpouring or an angry rant. It was like she had rehearsed every word, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. She talked about needing space, about wanting to find herself again, about losing her identity in the marriage. None of it made sense. What had happened? What had changed? But then she said it, something that stopped me in my tracks. "You know, I've made a lot of sacrifices for you over the years," Lauren continued, her voice steady. "And I don't think you appreciate them. I deserve more." That phrase hit harder than anything else she said. I deserve more. It wasn't just a statement of dissatisfaction. It was an accusation. It was as if she was implying that everything that had gone wrong was my fault, that I had taken her for granted, that I had somehow failed her. I stared at her, unsure how to respond. How could she claim that I hadn't appreciated her when everything I had done was for us? I had always worked hard to give her the life she wanted. When she had wanted to move closer to her job, I'd agreed even though it meant a longer commute for me. When she wanted to take that yoga retreat, I made sure we could afford it, even skipping a vacation I'd been looking forward to so she could go. I had always tried to be a good husband. She never seemed unhappy before. What had changed? What was she really after? But I didn't argue with her. I stayed silent, listening to her vent about all the sacrifices she had made for me. She painted herself as the martyr, and I felt like a villain for not immediately begging her to stay. Then she dropped a bombshell that tied it all together. "I've been talking to a friend," she said, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "They've helped me see things more clearly. I think it's time for me to move on." A friend. Who was this friend? Why was someone else involved in this? I had never heard her mention this friend before. It wasn't like her to keep people like that from me, especially not when it came to something as important as our marriage. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Who's this friend?" She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes flicking away as if she were debating whether to tell me the truth. "Just someone who's been helping me through this," she replied evasively, her tone cool, even distant. At that moment, everything started to click. I had overheard that phone call outside the cafe. She wasn't just talking about finding herself. This was calculated. This was a plan. And I was just the collateral damage. I didn't press her further. Couldn't. But in my mind, I was racing. Who was this friend? What had they told her? I was starting to feel like I was the last person to know what was really going on. This wasn't just about her needing space. This was about someone else manipulating her. And that was when the anger started bubbling to the surface. But I kept it inside. I stayed calm. I nodded, pretending to accept her reasoning. "If that's how you feel," I said, "I guess we should start figuring out the next steps." She looked surprised, as though she expected me to argue or beg her to stay. But I wasn't going to play that game. Something was wrong, and I wasn't going to make it easier for her to walk away with everything. Lauren seemed almost relieved, as if she had expected me to fight back harder. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her. I had my own plans now. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later, and they hit me harder than I had anticipated. The words were brutal, cold, calculated, as though Lauren had been rehearsing every line. Her demands were beyond aggressive. Half the house, my savings, my investments, even the car. All of it was to be hers. And then there was the vague mention of spousal support. The more I read, the more it became clear that this wasn't just her wanting to leave. She wanted to take everything I had, and then some. At first, I couldn't understand why. This wasn't like her. This wasn't the woman I had married, but it didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. There was someone else behind this, a voice guiding her. I knew it, and I was going to find out who it was. I didn't confront her right away. I wasn't foolish enough to let her know that I had caught on. I knew she was expecting me to crumble, to beg for her to stay. But I had made my move already. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I decided to do something that would turn the tables in my favor. I started digging. I knew she hadn't blocked me on social media, so I began scrolling through her profile. I wasn't obsessed, but I needed to know what I was up against. That's when I saw it. A guy named Jake, his comments, his likes, and the way he interacted with her posts. It wasn't anything outright flirtatious, but it was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. The more I looked, the more it seemed like this Jake was more than just a casual acquaintance. He posted a photo at the same cafe Lauren had been pacing outside of weeks ago. On the same day, too. My stomach churned. Was he the one pulling the strings? As I dug deeper, I found more subtle connections, more comments, more interaction between them. One selfie he posted seemed to be taken from what looked like her new apartment. The pieces were falling into place, and I was no longer guessing. I was sure now. Lauren had been planning this. She wasn't just leaving me. She was building a life with Jake, and I had been played. But I wasn't about to sit back and let her walk away with everything. I needed to know the full truth, so I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out to our mutual friends. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be them. Lisa was the first person I called. She had been one of Lauren's closest friends for years. I kept the conversation casual at first, asking if she had heard from Lauren lately or if anything seemed off. She hesitated before replying. I don't know, maybe? She's been going through some stuff, but I'm not really sure. That was odd. Lisa was never this evasive. I pressed a little more, but the conversation quickly became defensive, like she was trying to distance herself from the whole situation. I could tell she knew more than she was letting on. But I wasn't going to get anything from her, not today. I tried Emily next. She wasn't as close to Lauren, but she had been around enough to know if something was wrong. Emily was more open at first, but when I started asking about Lauren's recent behavior and this mysterious friend, she clammed up. I'm not sure, but I don't think there's much to it, she said. I wouldn't worry. But as I pushed further, Emily abruptly ended the call. It was strange. Too strange. Something wasn't right. I couldn't just ignore it. To my surprise, Emily called me back a few hours later. She sounded different, like she had something to confess. After a long pause, she finally spoke. I think you need to know something, she said. Lauren's been spending a lot of time with someone named Jake. He's been advising her about the divorce. I don't know much else, but from what I've heard, it sounds like they've been planning this for a while. Jake. The name was the final piece of the puzzle. I knew it. She wasn't just going through a tough time. She was plotting, and he was right there beside her, feeding her delusions about a fresh start. It wasn't just about me. It was about them together. I wasn't about to let this happen. I had to know the full story, so I decided to confront Lauren, but not directly. I wasn't about to give her the upper hand, so I took a different route. One Saturday, I followed Lauren after work, keeping my distance, hoping to catch her in the act. I didn't follow her too closely. I didn't need to. I just parked a few blocks away from the apartment building she had moved into recently. A couple of hours later, she emerged from the building, right on time. But she wasn't alone. Jake was with her. They didn't hold hands. They didn't kiss. But the way they moved together, the way they leaned into each other while talking, it was enough to make my stomach turn. They got into his car, and I stayed frozen in place, watching as they drove off. I didn't need to follow them any further. The truth was right in front of me. Lauren wasn't just leaving me. She was leaving me for Jake. I sat in my car for a while, processing everything. The woman I had trusted with everything, the woman I had built my life with, was now scheming behind my back with another man. I had been preparing for this moment, but the reality of it was still a punch to the gut. The days that followed were a blur. I had everything I needed. The divorce papers were already in my hands, her demands clear. It wasn't just about ending our marriage. It was about taking everything from me. The house, the savings, my investments, and the car. All of it was hers, or so she thought. I wasn't about to roll over. I had already moved everything. The house, the savings, the investments, all were locked down, transferred into a trust under my mom's name. She thought she had me cornered, but she hadn't realized just how far I had gone to protect myself. I knew the first mediation would be tense. I walked into that room knowing full well that she had no idea what was coming. I kept my expression neutral as Lauren's lawyer started going through her list of demands, detailing how I should hand over half the house and all my assets. He seemed confident, but I could tell something wasn't right. When it was my turn, I stayed calm. I didn't interrupt. My lawyer slid a stack of papers across the table, documents that would change everything. Her lawyer picked them up, skimming through them at first, but his face changed when he reached the last few pages. His expression shifted from confident to confused. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. I leaned back in my chair, watching as Lauren's lawyer flipped through the documents. "These," my lawyer explained calmly, "are the transfers of all major assets into a trust under my client's mother's name. They were completed several weeks before the divorce filing. The trust is irrevocable." The room fell silent. Lauren's lawyer turned to her, his confusion now mixed with frustration. "You didn't mention this to me," he said flatly. Lauren's face went pale as she snatched the papers from her lawyer's hands, her fingers shaking as she flipped through them. She went from disbelief to pure fury. In an instant, "This can't be real," she hissed, staring at the notarized signatures, the dates that lined up perfectly. It was over. Her plan had backfired. She had underestimated me, and now it was all unraveling in front of her eyes. "Did you plan this?" She spat at me, her eyes blazing with anger. "You knew I was going to file, and you set this up to screw me over." I didn't say a word. There was nothing more to say. The evidence spoke for itself. Her lawyer, now visibly annoyed, asked my lawyer to explain further. He did so methodically, with every piece of proof to make the transfers airtight. There was nothing they could do. The trust was legal. The assets were protected. Lauren's face went from shock to rage. "You're unbelievable," she hissed, leaning forward in her chair, her voice low and venomous. "I can't believe you would do this to me." I remained silent, letting her rage consume her. This wasn't about me doing something to her. This was about protecting myself. Because, for the first time, I realized she had never been the woman I thought she was. The mediation ended with her lawyer muttering something about reassessing their approach. It was obvious to everyone that they had no more moves to make. After the meeting, Lauren pulled me aside in the hallway. Her face was a mixture of fury and desperation. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You're going to regret this." I stared at her coldly. "I already regret trusting you," I said quietly. "That's the only regret I have." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Lauren went into full meltdown mode. She bombarded me with calls, voicemails that ranged from calm apologies to angry rants. First, she seemed regretful, asking if we could work things out. But then, as the days passed, the tone of her messages shifted. She blamed me for everything. She accused me of being vindictive. She called me a coward, a thief, everything under the sun. But I ignored her. Then came the stories. She started telling everyone that the divorce was just a joke, that it was some elaborate prank. At first, a few people bought it. But the more they asked questions, the more her story started to fall apart. If it was a prank, why had we filed actual legal paperwork? Why had she hired a lawyer? Her narrative began to unravel. One of our mutual friends, Matt, reached out to me. He had been on the fence, unsure of what to believe. But after everything started to come out, he sent me a message. When we met up, he showed me a string of texts between Lauren and Jake, the man who had been whispering in her ear this whole time. "I thought you should see this," Matt said, his face serious. "This isn't just about her wanting a divorce. She was planning this from the start, with Jake coaching her every step of the way. I stared at Matt's phone, my mind racing. The texts made it clear. Lauren wasn't just emotionally checking out. She was working with Jake to secure her future at my expense. In one message, she had written, "Once the settlement's done, we'll have everything we need. I just need him to agree to the terms." Jake's reply was chilling. "Don't back down. Make him feel guilty. He owes you. Start fresh once you've got the money." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. She hadn't been the victim she claimed to be. She had been manipulating me the whole time with Jake's help. It didn't take long for the truth to spread. Matt shared the texts with a few more mutual friends. Lauren's story fell apart faster than I could have imagined. The people who had supported her started to pull away. Even her closest allies began distancing themselves from her. By the time the divorce was finalized, she had nothing but her personal belongings. Her lawyer quietly dropped her case, realizing there was no legal leg to stand on. All of her bold demands had crumbled under the weight of the trust one had set up. As for Jake, he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. It was clear now that he had been using her, just as she had been using me. When it became clear she wasn't walking away with anything, he vanished. Lauren's confidence plummeted. The calls and texts kept coming, but now they were desperate. She begged me to talk, to settle, to work things out, but I had nothing left to say. Even her family started to pull away. Her brother apologized for his earlier outbursts. "I didn't know what she was doing to you," he admitted. "I'm sorry. As for me, I got my peace. The house, my savings, and the life I had worked for were still mine. And, most importantly, I had regained control of my own future. Lauren was a chapter in my past, and I wouldn't be revisiting it. The rest of my story was mine to write. The people closest to us aren't who we think they are. Trust, once broken, can never truly be repaired. In relationships, we can never ignore the small signs that something is wrong. Our instincts often tell us what we refuse to believe. It's important to protect ourselves, not just financially, but emotionally. When things begin to shift, the truth may be hard to face, but facing it head-on is the only way to reclaim our power. Trusting blindly can leave us vulnerable, but being aware of the changes around us can ensure we aren't left with nothing when the storm finally breaks.